This is part 3 in the Craftsman King Seeley 6-inch joiner rebuild series. If you haven't seen part 2, click the link at the top of the screen. In this video, we will be finishing up with the disassembly to include disassembling the motor. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. We got a lot to cover, so let's get to it. The pedestal stand has 2 mounting brackets and we've already removed those, so now we're just removing the screw out of the first one. And then we're going to remove that power panel. And it's got 2 slotted screws with square head nuts. There's actually some springs on these screws as well. I guess that's to give the power panel a little bit of flex so you don't break it off if you bump it. But we'll go ahead and remove the hardware from the power panel, and then we'll set it aside and disassemble it in a little bit. Next we have the motor, and we're going to go ahead and remove the motor mounting plate from the motor. So it's got these 4 screws that hold it to the plate, and they have square head nuts on them with washers. And sometimes those are carriage bolts. These are just square head screws with a washer on the other end as well. Once we get all 4 of those off, the plate will lift off and you've got that other screw for the column bracket. So the previous owner had put some electrical tape, I guess back in the 50s, on this end of the shaft to hold that key on there so the key didn't go flying away and he didn't lose it. Of course, that electrical tape is deteriorated. So we're going to try to get that key out of there, but it's rusted in there pretty good. So I think we'll just spray that thing down with some PB Blaster and get at it a little bit later on. And you can see all of the wood filings and shavings that are inside that motor. This is by far the worst caked up motor I've ever seen. And it ran. It still runs. But man, you would not believe how much stuff is inside this thing. Alright, so we'll start disassembling the motor. And we'll start with removing that terminal cover. It's got 2 slotted screws on it. I've included the owner's manual for the motor in the description of the video as well. Look at the inside of that thing, man. That's just crazy. I've never seen that much stuff inside a motor. And it just gets worse. I mean, once we get into the stator, it's completely caked up. But it runs. So next, we've got these 4 screws that hold the felt retainer on this end, and those slots are kind of boogered up, so I was using a chisel to kind of clean them out so that I could get a slotted screwdriver in there. But once we get all 4 of them out of there, I think the blade on that one screwdriver was a little thick. So once we get them all out of there, we can lift the felt cover off. And I'll be placing all these parts in order on top up there where I just laid that felt cover. So next you've got the, I'm just making sure that the gasket's not in the wrong place. When I get to it, next you've got the felt. There it is. And this is because that the ball bearings that are inside this motor are open on this end. Then you've got the end cap. And just, that's grease that's on there. It's all caked up and solid at this point. You can see that the bearing is open there. And then we've got the gasket, the end cap gasket, which we'll probably remake a couple of those out of some gasket material. I don't know if these are salvageable or not. So that's the order of how these go on to this end of the motor, the terminal end. So next we'll just remove the capacitor cover. And that is a cardboard box inside the base of the motor, and the capacitor is sitting inside it. Of course, there's the requisite amount of wood debris in there as well. So this capacitor is still good. If it wasn't, you can't find these small, what we call sardine can capacitors anymore. And most of your modern day capacitors are too big to fit inside the base. So I'm going to go ahead and mark this capacitor. They're probably not polarized, but I'm not so good with electrical, so I mark everything. We're going to be cutting the 2 wires that go to the capacitor, so I'm just marking where those wires are going to go. Because they were soldered on there, and that's why we're cutting them. And if you've seen any of my other rebuild videos, this is pretty much what I do with every single motor I work on. I mark everything, take lots of pictures. All right, so now we're at the switch, which is over here on the left side as we're looking at it. And all of the wires going to the switch were soldered to the switch as well. So we're cutting them and marking them. And we're going to be replacing the power cord for this motor as well. So we're going to be cutting the existing power cord off and then marking all the wires that go to it. That wire was kind of camouflaged in there. I was like, well, I just cut a wire. I know I did. Then we'll chop that cord off. And then push the remains back into the motor there. And you can see they used a hog loop as the stress relief, and that's what we will be doing when we replace it. We'll hang on to that end, that way we know what wire goes where. Next we're going to remove the switch. So it has this nut on the outside. And then we can just pull the switch straight through. And there's the on-off plate. And next we'll remove the base. So this motor was not grounded, and when we rebuild it, we will be grounding it. And we will ground to one of these two screws that we're removing from the base when we ground it. But there are two screws in here that mount the base to the stator. And once we get those off, then we'll be able to lift the base right off of the motor. Like so. So now we're removing the various wires from the terminal bar and marking them. And you'll notice on the left side of the motor there's a red button inside that silver panel, round panel. That is the overload protection switch, or klaxon. And we'll be removing it as well. It works. If for whatever reason your motor doesn't run, that switch could be bad, and you can actually replace those if you just Google klaxon motor overload protection switch. There's like a 3-digit code on the back side of that switch, and you can use that code to figure out what one you need and order one. Had that happen on one of my motors, and once I replaced it, the motor ran like a champ. But most of the time they're not bad, so I've only had to replace one in all the rebuilds I've done. All right, so now we can start to remove these long screws that hold the motor together. There's 4 of them. So it has those acorn cap nuts on each end of it. And then it's just a long screw. It's threaded on each end. There, like I said, there's 4 of them. So once we get all 4 of those out of there, now we can lay the motor back on its side. We need to get this stator band off. So this is made out of steel, and it's just folded over to hold it together. So if we pry it up, we can probably separate the 2 halves, or the 2 ends, like so, and then slide the motor out of it. And look at all of that sawdust around the stator. So this one's in pretty bad condition. The motor data panel is not too bad, but the stator is really rusted. So now we're removing the felt retainer on this end. This is affectionately called the other end. So you have the felt retainer, and then you're going to have the felt. and then you've got the end cap, and then you've got two spring washers. They're stuck together. And then you've got the gasket. And again, you can see that this bearing is open on this end. So this gasket's even worse than the other one. Now we're just tapping the other end of the motor to get it off of there. Separate it from the stator. And then we need to use a puller to pull it up the shaft because the bearing is still grabbing on the shaft of the rotor. There we go. So we'll set that aside. Move all that stuff. All right, so now we need to do kind of the same thing on this end. This is the terminal end. So we got to be kind of careful because we got wires that are on the inside of this thing. And we don't want to pull on those wires a whole lot, especially with how brittle they are in this motor. So back when these motors were made, the shielding that was used on the wiring is fabric, and it got stiff over the years. So these wires are real easy to break. Now we can pull the rotor out. And then we can start tucking those wires that were connected to the terminal bar down inside the motor housing. Now we can remove the terminal bar. It has two screws. There it is. And then we've still got the overload protection switch inside there and the actual switch for the governor, which is what we're removing now. It's the switch assembly, and it has two screws as well. And then the overload protection switch has two screws on it, and my head's in the way, so you really can't see that. There's one, and there's the other. Now we can pull all that out of there. So that's the insulator for the switch. And then that square plate with the hole in the center was the switch shield. That's the insulator. And there's the switch. There's the terminal bar. I'm just looking at the markings on it. I'm going to go back and remark my wires so I know where they go. There's only 2 connectors on there, so it's kind of a 50-50 guess, but having it and knowing it are 2 different things. That actually is number 6. There we go. All right, so we got the terminal end frame, and we're just going to punch that bearing right out of there. So they get driven from the inside out. They've got a little shelf that they're sitting on. A little step, I guess, is what you would call it. So we're going to use a wooden dowel to just drive that bearing out of there. We're going to be replacing these bearings. And there you go. And we've got that other bearing in the other end frame, but we need to remove the air cone. It has 2 screws on it. And then it just comes out of there. And then we can drive that bearing out just like we did on the other one. The last thing is we need to remove that cover panel or panel for the overload protection switch. And it's got 2 drive screws that hold it in place, and you can remove those from the inside just like we did on the joiner with the Craftsman logo and the model number panel. So once we've knocked those out, that panel is off of there. And there we go. Next, we've got the rotor, and for it, we're not going to do a whole lot of disassembling. We're just going to remove these 2 springs on the outside. Sometimes I go ahead and disassemble the entire governor, but on this rebuild, we're just going to remove these 2 springs. So if one of your springs is broken, and as long as you've got 1 good spring or the pieces of it, you can measure it and you could order a replacement from McMaster-Carr. So next we've got the stator band and the data panel, and it is riveted to the stator band. So I'm just drilling out those rivets. And you can see once I get this data panel off of here what the stator band is supposed to look like under this panel. You can see how clean it is and the lines that are on it. See, that's what it's supposed to look like. So we're going to try to clean it up, but I don't think it's going to clean up very well. So we'll probably be fabricating a new stator band for this. But we'll see. And the data panel Although it's really dirty, it's not in too bad of condition, so I don't think we're going to replace it. I think we're just going to clean it up. All right, so we got the power panel, and the power panel has this mounting bracket on the top. It has these long screws with these weird nuts on this end of it. And these screws are actually made out of Zamak or aluminum, I'm not sure which, as are the nuts. But that's how you remove that mounting bracket, and it also helps you in disassembling the power panel. So next, you can see it's not grounded, and we're going to be cutting this thing up and making it a grounded power panel. So we just need to completely disassemble it for now. And we have to bend those ends away from it and then go ahead and remove that nut for the switch so that the switch can push through when we separate the covers. Like so. And then we need to remove all of this junk from the inside. So some of these I'm going to undo with a screwdriver, and some of them I'm just going to cut because we're not keeping any of that stuff. In fact, the only thing we are going to keep is the switch itself. So these have some clips that you can just push in on the side, and then they'll push through the back cover. Kind of a pain in the butt, but I like them better than the plastic ones. My head in the way. And then this one can't really get to the bottom side of it that's closest to that wall on the left there. So we're just going to remove the screw that holds that clip together, and then we'll be able to push it through. And that's going to wrap up this video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like and subscribe. In the next video, I guess we're going to get to cleaning up this stuff. So more to come. As always, I appreciate the support, and I will see you next time.